Good afternoon, students. Today is Thursday, 9 September 2021. We are moving right along through the material. Now let me talk to you a little bit about what I call the COVID plan. I sent each of you a long email the other day explaining what we'll be doing this semester. Everyone has to be back to campus full density by the 20th of September. Now, we don't meet on the 20th. We will be meeting on the 21st. So, on the 21st of September, which is a Tuesday, we will be in the classroom together. Okay, until then, I'm going to be posting videos. So there's a video today, the one I'm about to do, and there will be 2 videos next week. So we're going to go directly from online instruction to full density in-person instruction beginning on the 21st of September. All right, and I explained everything in my letter. That letter that I sent to you is also posted on Canvas, so you can go back and read it as often as you need to see what we're doing. Speaking of postings, there are quite a few postings now. I'm not going to go back through all of them. You can check for yourself, but I can tell you that for the current lecture that I'm about to start, there are 3 items posted. First of all, there is the reading by J.L. Mackie. I'm going to hold up my copy of the article. You can see it. The title is Evil and Omnipotence. And by the way, you can see how marked up my copy is with highlighting and marginal notations and so on. The second item is a short biography of Mackie that you may find interesting. I put optional reading alongside it, so feel free to read it if you'd like, but you don't have to. And what I mean by that is I won't test you on it. And finally, I have posted my lecture notes for Mackie's article. You can follow along today. I'll try to stay fairly close to my lecture notes, and the exam questions will be primarily drawn from these lectures, which are based on the notes that you have. Okay, so those are the postings. Our exam is coming up quickly. Our exam will be on the 28th of September this month, which is 19 days from today. It'll be 2 weeks from this coming Tuesday. The exam will be administered on Canvas. So I'll tell you more about it as the days go by, as we get closer. But I can tell you that on the day of the 28th, the day of the exam, you will go into Canvas. And once you get started on the exam, you'll have 75 minutes to complete it. Your score will be calculated automatically, and I will get access to the results. I'll probably compile some statistics for you, which I'll discuss in the next lecture, the next class lecture. Okay, so make sure you're keeping up with the material. Don't put off the reading until just before the exam. Then you'll be overwhelmed with work. And certainly you shouldn't put off watching the videos, because if you have to watch, let's say, 3 or 4 videos on the day before the exam, it's going to be overwhelming. There'll be too much to process, and you may have other things to do, other obligations. So make sure you watch the videos as they're posted and don't put them off until the end. Now, if you turn to the reading list for the course, you'll see that we're about to start a new topic today. Not only a new reading, but a new topic. The topic might be called The Problem of Evil. And we're going to be reading 2 essays on this topic. The first is by Mackie, the one I just held up for you. His essay is entitled Evil and Omnipotence. And after spending 2 class periods on that, which is today and this coming Tuesday, we will then have 3 class periods remaining before the exam, and we're going to devote all 3 of those class meetings to the second article on the problem of evil. It's by a philosopher named William Rowe, and his essay is entitled The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism. So both of these essays by Mackie and by Swinburne are quite famous. That, of course, doesn't mean everyone agrees with everything they say in those articles, but they're well written, well argued, and if you disagree with the conclusions, then you have to find a way to call the argument itself into question, either by denying one or more of its premises or by showing that the conclusion of the argument does not follow from the premises. In other words, you would try to show that the argument is invalid in some way. So that's where we are, and that's where we're headed. Turn now to the lecture notes that I've posted for you. I'm going to go through my lecture notes today. By the way, I noticed, I just glanced over here, I found a nice image of J.L. Mackie. You can see what he looked like. Mackie was born in 1917, a little over a century ago, and died in 1981. In fact, if you look at the first footnote of my lecture notes, you'll see a little bit of biographical information about Mackie, just a little. John Leslie Mackie, and he typically published with his initials, J.L. John Leslie Mackie was born in Sydney, Australia on 25 August 1917. He died on 12 December 1981 at the age of 64. Now that's disturbing to me because I'm 64 and I'm hoping I have many years to come, but one never knows. His father was born in Scotland and his mother in Australia. So I guess you could say he was Scots-Australian, at least ethnically speaking. This essay, the essay that you read, was published when Mackie was 37 years old. It has been widely reprinted in collections of essays. All page references are to the original version. So this, the essay, the article that I held up, this is the original version of this article. It was published in a journal called Mind in April 1955, and the pages that are given in this version are the ones I use in my lecture notes, okay, as opposed to the page references in some reprinted version of it. Partly that's to remind me of the source of the quotations that I give in the lecture notes. Now, before we get started on my lecture notes, let me give a general introduction to the so-called problem of evil. Historically, people who believe in God have tried to provide reasons for their belief. And the hope is that by providing good reasons for your belief that God exists, other people who accept those reasons will in turn come to believe in God. So people who believe in God have gone around arguing in favor of the existence of God. We can think of these as theistic arguments. These are arguments designed to establish that God exists. But there have always been people who are disbelievers, people who believe that there's not a God, people like Mackie. And these atheists, as I'll call them right now, atheists have tried to establish that there's no God. They have tried to provide reasons that lead to the conclusion that there is not a God. Now, there have been many arguments of both types. There have been many theistic arguments, and there have been many atheistic arguments. We're going to be looking at maybe the most popular atheistic argument that has ever been devised. It has appeared in many different versions. In fact, we're going to be looking at two different versions in this course. The version by Mackie starting today, and in a couple of weeks, we'll be starting the version by William Rowe. Actually, a week from today, we'll be starting that essay by William Rowe. And one of the things I'll do when we get to Rowe is explain exactly how his argument differs from Mackie's argument. There are both similarities and differences, and I want you to understand both of those. So the problem of evil is the problem of trying to reconcile certain things. And in particular, how does one reconcile the existence of a God who has certain qualities or characteristics with the existence of evil? So Mackie puts it in a simple way on the first page of his article. I didn't put this in my notes, but I'll direct your attention to the first page of his article. Mackie says the following: in its simplest form, The problem, and he's referring to the problem of evil, is this, colon, God is omnipotent, semicolon, God is wholly good, semicolon, and yet evil exists, period. So Mackie has just asserted three propositions. Actually, when I say asserted, I don't mean that Mackie believes these propositions, because he doesn't. What he's saying is anyone who believes these three propositions has a problem, the problem of evil. He goes on to say there seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. So let's take a look at this and see what he means by that. Let's take a look at the first two propositions that he listed. God is omnipotent. Now, we're going to explore what that means today and a little bit when we get to William Rowe's essay. But in general, what does it mean to be omnipotent? Potent means power. So you and I have a certain amount of potency or power, right? You and I, I'm sure, are strong enough to lift a 10-pound weight. So we have at least that degree of power. Omni, the prefix omni, means all or all-encompassing. So a being who is omnipotent, or to pronounce it properly, omnipotent, is a being who is all-powerful, who is powerful in every way. Omnipotent. Okay, I think that's enough for now. Let's turn to the second proposition. The second proposition says God is wholly good. And the word holy is important. You and I are good, but neither of us, as much as we might like to think we are, is wholly good. Good in a perfect way, or good in every way. But God is said to be wholly good, unlike you and me, who are merely good. So what would follow if there's a God who is both omnipotent and wholly good? If God is omnipotent, then God can do anything. If God is wholly good, then God is motivated to do the very best. Why then would there be any evil in the world? If God can prevent all evil, which is what omnipotence seems to entail, and if God is wholly good, then God would want to eliminate or prevent all the evil. Why then is there any evil at all in the world? So far, it looks like if God is omnipotent and wholly good, there shouldn't be any evil. But that contradicts the third proposition, which says evil exists. Okay, so that's the first possibility. Mackie says any two of these three lead to the contradiction of the third one. So now let's take 1 and 3 and see what happens. Let's assume that God exists and is omnipotent, and let's assume that evil exists. If God exists and is omnipotent and evil exists, then it follows that God is not wholly good. God may be good in the way you and I are good, but God must have some imperfections. God must not be wholly good or perfectly good or good in every way. That would have to be the case in order to explain how an omnipotent being coexists with evil. It must be that God is not wholly good. So that's the second possibility. If God is omnipotent and evil exists, then we have arrived at the contradictory of the second proposition that God is wholly good. Now there's one more possibility. Let's assume now that propositions 2 and 3 are true and see what happens to proposition 1. Proposition 2 says that God is wholly good, and proposition 3 says that evil exists. It seems to follow, doesn't it, that God is not omnipotent. If God is wholly good, God has a powerful motivation to prevent evil and to eliminate any evil that happens to come into being. But we're assuming, for the sake of argument, that evil exists. Well, doesn't it follow that God is not omnipotent? There must be some limit to what God can do. And that would explain why God, being wholly good, has not prevented or eliminated all the evil. So Mackie is giving a kind of simple version of the problem of evil at this point, right? Just to kind of help the reader along. I didn't put that in my lecture notes, but I decided I'd go over it with you before we get to the lecture notes, which are a little bit more detailed and rigorous. Okay, I hope you have a feel now for the argument from evil. It starts off with an assumption that there's evil in the world and tries to draw a conclusion about either the existence of God or the nature of God. Okay? Either that God doesn't exist, or that God does exist but is not all-powerful, or that God does exist but is not holy or perfectly good. Okay, so let's read along. Let's follow along on the lecture notes. I'm just going to read them and pause occasionally to explain or elaborate things or give examples. If I were lecturing in class, you would be able to raise your hand and stop me and we could have a short dialogue. That can't happen with this video format, but you're certainly welcome to send me an email after you're done watching the video. So you should be making notes along the way, just as you would in the classroom. And if something is puzzling and it never gets sorted out by the end of the video, then feel free to send me an email and I'll try to explain it to you. And I want to read the footnotes as we go along as well. So let's get started reading my lecture notes and discussing them. According to J.L. Mackie, and then I have a footnote which we already went over, the following 6 propositions are logically inconsistent. Now I have to stop right there before we even look at the 6, because you need to understand what it means for 2 or more propositions to be logically inconsistent. So let's look at my footnote 2, in which I explain that to you. Here's what I say there. To say that a set of 2 or more propositions is logically inconsistent is to say that they cannot all be true. They cannot all be true. So you can probably figure out what it means to say that a set of 2 or more propositions is logically consistent. To say that 2 or more propositions are logically consistent means they can all be true. It doesn't mean that they are, in fact, all true. It means that, logically speaking, they could all be true. There's no contradiction in asserting all of them. So let's go back to the concept of logical inconsistency, because I was just pausing to explain the concept of logical consistency. Let me read again what I just read to you. To say that a set of 2 or more propositions is logically inconsistent is to say that they cannot all be true. Now think about that. If you've got 2 or more propositions and you know that they cannot all be true, don't you also now know that at least one of them is false? Not that at least one of them can be false, but at least one of them is false. Okay? If a set of 2 or more propositions cannot all be true, if that's impossible, then at least one of them must be false. Okay? And that's what it means to say that a set of propositions is logically inconsistent. Now let's continue reading this footnote. I want you to be aware that while Mackie is a very smart man, far smarter than I am, I'm the first to admit that, borderline genius, if not an outright genius. But that doesn't mean Mackie is right about everything. Even geniuses occasionally are wrong about certain matters for various reasons. Not everyone agrees with Mackie that the 6 propositions we're about to examine are logically inconsistent. And I'll even give you one prominent name, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, who's still alive, as I recall, but now very old. Plantinga argued as early as 1974, which is still 19 years after Mackie's article was published. Plantinga argued in that book entitled God, Freedom, and Evil that the 6 propositions are logically consistent. He disagreed with Mackie. Mackie thinks they're logically inconsistent, and therefore that at least one of them is false. Plantinga said, "You're wrong, Mackie, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to try to persuade you that you're wrong. The 6 propositions can all be true." And I'll spare you his reasoning, but he tried to show that there could be a world in which all 6 of these propositions are true. And that would undermine Mackie's argument from evil. Now, for the sake of discussion going forward, let's just assume that Mackie is correct about this and Plantinga is wrong or incorrect. And we have to make an assumption one way or another. So let's, just for the sake of going forward, just for the sake of discussion, or perhaps for the sake of argument, let's just assume that Mackie is right and that the 6 propositions we're about to lay out and discuss are indeed logically inconsistent. Ultimately, you have to make up your own mind. Mackie thinks they're inconsistent, and he's going to try to persuade you of that. So here we go. Notice in my lecture notes I have indented the 6 propositions, 1 through 6. I've numbered them. And in all cases, I quote Mackie. I used quotation marks, and I give you the page reference. So I'm trying to stick as closely as I can to Mackie's actual wording. Here are the 6 propositions. Let's just list them, and then we'll come back and discuss why Mackie thinks they're inconsistent. The first one, which Mackie states on page 200, is there is a God. Now, he doesn't tell us the nature of that God or the characteristics of that God, but you can fill in with whatever your understanding of God is. Perhaps the God you happen to believe in, if you do. Okay, there's a God. That's number 1. Number 2 tells you something about that being, and it says God is omnipotent. And we've talked a little bit about what that means. It has something to do with being all-powerful or powerful in every way. It has something to do with there being no limits to what you can do. Third, God is wholly good. Now, we already talked about that as well. It means more than just being good, because you and I'm sure, are good, morally speaking, but we're not wholly good. We sometimes do things that are wrong. Sometimes we make bad decisions or bad choices, and so on. So we may be good on balance, or good all things considered, or mostly good, but God is said to be wholly good. And that's a thing of a different nature, a different sort. Okay, that's number 3. The 4th proposition is that evil exists. Again, Mackie is not claiming that these are true. He's not saying he believes them. He's trying to pose a problem for someone who does believe all of them. So, evil exists. That's number 4 on the list. Now, Mackie says on the first page where we were reading a moment ago, Mackie says at the very bottom that the contradiction between these propositions does not arise immediately. So Mackie seems to be conceding that the 4 propositions that we just listed are not really themselves logically inconsistent. We need some other propositions to add to those 4 to bring out the contradiction, to bring out the logical inconsistency. He says to show the contradiction, we need some additional premises, or perhaps some quasi-logical rules. I'm now reading at the top of page 2 of the article. We need some quasi-logical rules. In a moment later, he refers to them as additional premises. And there are 2 of them that he gives. And here they are. I added them to the other 4, and I numbered them 5 and 6. So here's number 5, straight from Mackie on page 201. He says, good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, unquote. Well, let's spend a moment on that. It's got 2 clauses, good is opposed to evil, comma, and then the rest of it, in such a way that. So the first part says good and evil are opposed to one another. So when 2 things are opposed, they're kind of clashing like this, right? They're pushing against one another. And one of them, the strongest one, will push the other one away, right? So I'm assuming this one's the strongest. This one's pushing the other one. Okay, they're opposed. They're in opposition or conflict with one another. And the reason Mackie calls this a quasi-logical rule, I think, I'm speculating because he doesn't tell us, but I'm actually pretty sure he calls it this because it has to do with unpacking the meaning of something. Quasi-logical. Think of logical as having to do with the meanings of words. So what does it mean for one thing to be opposed to another? Mackie says, what does it mean for good to be opposed to evil? So let this be good and this be evil. When you say that good and evil are opposed to one another, you're saying that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, as far as its power permits. Now, different things have different degrees of power. Take any two people. One of them is stronger than the other one, physically, for example, unless they're exactly equal in strength. So, when Mackie says good is opposed to evil in proposition number 5, what he means is that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. So, to whatever degree it has power, it will use that power to get rid of as much evil as it can. Now, maybe its power is limited in some way, in which case it may not be able to eliminate all of the evil that exists, but it will eliminate as much of the evil as it can, given its power. So that's what Mackie means by good is opposed to evil. It just means a good thing will eliminate evil as far as it can. So that's proposition number 5. And I think you can understand why Mackie calls it a quasi-logical rule. It's a kind of definition of what it means for good to be opposed to evil. Now, the 6th proposition says the following, and it's from page 201. Quote, there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. It sounds like a tautology, doesn't it? It sounds like it's just, it's true by definition. In fact, maybe it is. Maybe it is a logical rule about the meaning of the word omnipotent. Mackie seems to be saying that by omnipotent, I mean it has no limits to what it can do. It's so powerful that it can do anything. It's unlimited in its power. Okay, so he calls that a quasi-logical rule. Again, I think it's because it unpacks the meaning of the word omnipotent. It means no limits to what you can do. Okay, so I hope you're with me. I'm trying to go by baby steps so you're not confused or frightened. Mackie has stated 6 propositions. Again, it doesn't mean he believes all 6 of them. I'm sure believes some of them, but not others. But maybe not others. Mackie is saying, here are 6 propositions. He is now making a claim about how they're related. He is saying they cannot all be true, from which it follows that at least one of them is false. So I want to try to explain to you why he thinks they're inconsistent. And I think the best way to do that is to construct an argument. And I want the argument to use 5 of these 6 propositions and show that from those 5, the falsity of the 6th one follows. So look at the bottom of page 1 of my lecture notes. I'm going to start off with proposition 5. And you can check and see that the first premise of the argument is identical to proposition 5 from up higher on the page. And it goes like this. Good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. I'm just bringing proposition 5 down and making it the first premise of this argument. The second premise, which is B, I used A, B, C, D, E, so as not to confuse you. Earlier I used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Premise B is proposition 6 from above. it says there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. Now, what do you get when you put A and B together? What conclusion can you squeeze out of them? What inference can you draw from them? So you've got to put both A and B together in your mind, and I hope you can see that some third proposition, C, follows from them. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that good is opposed to evil in the sense in which Mackie explained it. A good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. The second premise says there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. Doesn't it follow from A and B that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely? That does seem to follow logically from A and B, doesn't it? Because we're putting two ideas together. We're putting the idea of a wholly good being, we're putting the idea of a good being, a wholly good being, together with the idea of an omnipotent being. And the conclusion is C, a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. If it has the power to eliminate evil completely, which we're assuming it does because it's omnipotent, then it will eliminate evil completely because it's wholly good. So it does seem to follow from A and B that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. There would be zero evil left once this wholly good omnipotent being got working. Right? Any evil that happened to exist would be eliminated instantly, and this being would prevent any further evil from coming into existence. So there wouldn't be any evil. Now, let's keep going with this, because so far we started off with propositions 5 and 6 from the list above, and we have drawn the conclusion C. Let's now add proposition 4 to our list, or to our argument. Make it a new premise. It says evil exists. That's proposition 4 from the list of 6 above. What do you get when you put C and D together? Remember, C was the conclusion from an earlier argument. Let's now use it as a premise for a new argument. And we're going to add to it D, which is a new premise. What do you get when you put C and D together? Well, let's state them and then draw the conclusion. C says a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. D, the new premise, says evil exists. Well, doesn't it follow that there is no good omnipotent thing? If you look at the grand conclusion of this argument, it's E. A good omnipotent thing does not exist. That seems to follow logically from C and D. And notice that proposition E is the negation of something in the original list of 6. Proposition E says a good omnipotent thing does not exist. That means either God does not exist, or God does exist but is not wholly good, or God does exist and is not omnipotent. So one of those earlier propositions listed as 1, 2, or 3, one of them has to be false. We've just proved it using propositions 5 and 6. Propositions 4, 5, and 6. So let me take a breath, stand back, and what have we accomplished? What I tried to show you is that if you start off with propositions 4, 5, and 6 from our list of 6, you can infer the falsity of either 1, 2, or 3. And that's what Mackie's claiming, is that you can't believe all 6 of those propositions. The reason you can't believe them, if you're rational, is because they cannot all be true. And this argument I just made at the bottom of page 1 of my lecture notes is designed to show you step by step what Mackie is saying. It's designed to persuade you that these 6 propositions really are inconsistent. Now, a moment ago I told you that Alvin Plantinga disagrees with Mackie. He thinks that the 6 propositions are logically consistent, meaning that they can all be true. So Plantinga must have a problem with this argument I just made. In other words, he must think that one of its premises is false, or that one of the inferences is invalid. By the way, how many inferences are there in that argument we just went over? There are 2. And you can see that because I used the word therefore twice. The first argument goes from A and B to C. That's a separate argument. A and B, therefore C. C, which is the conclusion of that argument, becomes a premise for a new argument. It joins up with D, and from C and D, we infer E. So there are 2 separate arguments being made here. They link up like a chain. It's called a chain argument. Right? My fingers are supposed to be the links of the chain. And just like a real chain is no stronger than its weakest link. So in an argument chain, if any of the arguments that make up the chain is weak, then the whole chain argument is weak. Or we could put it differently. We could say if any argument that makes up the chain argument is invalid, then the whole chain argument is invalid. So Alvin Plantinga, who disagrees with Mackie, Alvin Plantinga must either reject one of the premises of this argument or deny the validity of one of the 2 arguments or inferences. And I'm not going to go into which of those is the case. I'm just telling you that because he disagrees with Mackie, he has to do one of those things. Either show that a premise is false or show that an inference is invalid. Okay, turn the page. I propose to cover about half of Mackie today. I don't know exactly where that'll take us. I'll keep my eye on the clock. As soon as we reach an hour, I'll start thinking about winding it down. And I'll make sure I leave enough material so that we can get through it on Tuesday next week when we finish up this discussion of Mackie. Okay, turn to page 2 and let's continue. And I'm going to go back to reading now. If Mackie is correct that the 6 propositions are logically inconsistent, and again, let's assume that he is for the sake of discussion going forward. Just assume it. If Mackie's correct that these 6 propositions are logically inconsistent, then anyone who wishes to accept all 6 of them has a problem. Now, there are different kinds of problems. There are practical problems. There are psychological problems. There are theoretical problems. And there are logical problems. When Mackie says that trying to accept all 6 of these propositions creates a problem, he means a logical problem. And that the logical problem is you can't believe all 6 because they can't all be true. If you try to believe all 6 of them and they can't all be true, then you're bound to have at least one false belief. Maybe more, but at least one. And nobody wants to have a false belief. Have you ever had a false belief? Or rather, have you ever discovered that something you had believed for a while was false? Did it make you uncomfortable? I assume it did. I hope it did. What steps did you take to cast it out, to get rid of it, to stop believing it? Most people, when they discover that one or more of their beliefs are false, take steps to get rid of it and to see to it that it never gets back in to their set of beliefs. Here's a quick example to show you what I'm talking about. Many years ago, when I was in graduate school, I had a friend named Terry. And Terry and I used to argue about literally everything, anything and everything, in sometimes a stupid way. We would argue about music, which rock and roll act is the best, which song is the best, and it was silly. A lot of it was silly, but it was fun, and that's why we did it. One of the things Terry and I discussed and argued about was sports. One day when we were talking about football, we were talking about the Monday Night Football. And one of the longtime announcers for Monday Night Football was a man named Frank Gifford. You may have heard of him. Now, I knew that Frank Gifford had played pro football before he was an announcer, but I don't remember him. He came before I started paying attention to pro football. But somewhere along the line, I got the idea that Frank Gifford was a quarterback. To this day, I don't know where I got that information. But when I was discussing this with Terry, I said something about Frank Gifford being a quarterback when he played the game. And Terry looked at me like this and said, Frank Gifford was a running back. He wasn't a quarterback. So Terry and I had a flat out disagreement about the truth value of the proposition Frank Gifford was a quarterback. Now I know he could have been both a quarterback and a running back. So that could happen. But most people are primarily a quarterback or primarily a running back. So let's just interpret it that way. Was Frank Gifford primarily a quarterback when he played or primarily a running back? Now, Terry and I both dug in. I said, you're wrong. He was a quarterback. And he said, you're wrong. He was a running back. So, determined to find out who was right and who was wrong, since we couldn't both be right, and at least one of us had to be wrong, therefore, we decided upon the following procedure. We would go to the University of Arizona Library on our campus, and we would find a reputable sports encyclopedia on the shelf. And we agreed that before we even opened it, we would look it over, look at the title, see who published it, and so forth. Once we looked it over and agreed that it was authoritative, we would then open it up and get the information that would determine which of us was right and which was wrong. We did that. Guess who was right and guess who was wrong? I hate to admit it, it still rankles, but Terry was right and I was wrong. It was very disturbing to me to learn that I had that false belief. And I immediately began to wonder, where did I get that? By what procedure did I come to believe that Frank Gifford was a quarterback? How did that false belief creep into my set of beliefs? And I tried to figure it out so that I could prevent it from happening again. So now, today, I believe that Frank Gifford was a running back when he played the game. So I've gotten rid of my false belief, and thanks to Terry, who called me out on it, I replaced it with a true belief. So let's bring this back. It's a silly example, but it's supposed to show you that most people, certainly I'm one of them, are uncomfortable when they discover that they have a false belief. People want to believe true things and not anything that's false. So Mackie claims that the 6 propositions at the top of page 1 of my lecture notes are logically inconsistent. One of them, at least one of them, therefore, is false. Which one? Well, some people think they're all true. Alvin Plantinga disagrees with Mackie. But other people, like Mackie himself, believe that there's at least one false one. Which one do you think Mackie rejects or denies? Which one? There may be more than one, but Mackie rejects Proposition 1. Proposition 1 says there is a God. Mackie says, I disbelieve that. I believe that that is false. Mackie is an atheist. Mackie is a disbeliever in God. And what I mean by that is he believes that there is no God. And that's what I mean by calling him an atheist. Now notice, because Mackie disbelieves in the existence of God, what would he say about 2 and 3? 2 says God is omnipotent. I don't think Mackie would say that that's false. I think what he would say is that Proposition 2 presupposes something that is false. And therefore, it's neither true nor false. Right? Let me say that again. Proposition 2 says God is omnipotent. Now, Mackie doesn't want to come out and say that's false because that might suggest that he agrees that there's a God, but says that God is not omnipotent. And Mackie doesn't want to go down that road. Mackie would say Proposition 2 presupposes something, namely the existence of God, which is false. And because 2 has a false presupposition, Mackie would say 2 is neither true nor false. Right? It's neither true nor false. If he had to choose between those, he would say it's false, because he would definitely not want to say it's true that God is omnipotent, because that clearly would imply that he believes that there's a God, and he doesn't. So Mackie believes that Proposition 1 of the list of 6 is false. That's how he avoids the problem of evil. Notice, he doesn't solve the problem of evil. He avoids it entirely. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let's go back and start from the beginning on page 2 and read what I wrote there. I told you that I'd be interrupting myself to elaborate, make comments, give examples. That's what I'm doing, but I want to go back and read it now. If Mackie is correct that the 6 propositions are logically inconsistent, then anyone who wishes to accept all 6 of them has a problem. Not a practical problem or any other kind, but a logical problem. The problem, Mackie says, can be solved by giving up at least one of the propositions that constitute it. So, the logical problem of evil, according to Mackie, means someone who wants to accept all 6, but has to give up one of them reluctantly. Now, Mackie does not fall into that category because he doesn't want to believe all 6. He's happy to reject number 1, the one that says God exists. Okay? So Mackie is not solving the problem, he's avoiding the problem of evil. But what about someone like Plantinga, someone who believes in God? Plantinga presumably wants to believe all 6 of those propositions. But if Mackie is correct, which we're assuming, Plantinga cannot accept all 6 because they can't all be true. So Plantinga would have to give up one of those 6 propositions. And if he did, Mackie has a name for that. Mackie would say that is an adequate solution to the problem of evil. An adequate solution is where someone wants to accept all 6, realizes that he or she cannot do so, and rejects one of them. That would be an adequate solution to the problem of evil. Now, let's read the indented paragraph in my notes. It's from page 201. You'll notice I added some bracketed numerals. I'm simply drawing your attention to the list of 6 propositions. Mackie says the following. If you are prepared to say that God is not wholly good, which is a denial of number 3, or not quite omnipotent, which is a denial of 2, or that evil does not exist, which is a denial of 4, or that good is not opposed to the kind of evil that exists, which is a denial of 5, or that there are limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, which is a denial of 6, then the problem of evil will not arise for you. The problem of evil will not even arise. Okay, so there are adequate solutions to the problem of evil. Now, I realize I skipped footnote 3. When I was reading the previous part, let's go down and read footnote 3. Atheists such as Mackie do not wish to accept all 6 propositions. I'm repeating what I said a moment ago. They reject the first proposition, that there's a God. They reject that out of hand. Atheists do not therefore have a problem of evil, a logical problem of evil. Right? Mackie Mackie has no problem. Right? He doesn't lose any sleep at all by the problem of evil. He avoids it entirely by rejecting the first premise, the first proposition. So who has a problem of evil? Only theists, like Plantinga. Only theists, those who accept the first proposition, have a logical problem of evil. So, let's draw some conclusions. Since the problem of evil is not a problem for atheists, it would be inaccurate to say that they solve the problem. I don't go around solving problems that I don't have. If I have a problem, a practical problem, then of course I'll try to solve my problem. But if an atheist doesn't have a logical problem of evil, then it makes no sense to speak of the atheist solving that problem. You can't solve what you don't have. Or better yet, you can't solve a problem you don't have. But by disbelieving in God, but by disbelieving in God, atheists avoid the problem of evil. So to summarize everything I've been saying, I hope it's not confusing. Atheists like Mackie avoid the problem of evil altogether by denying that God exists. Only people who want to accept all six propositions have a problem of evil. And they can therefore try to solve that problem. And the way to solve it is what Mackie just said in that indented paragraph. By giving up proposition 2, that will solve it. That would be an adequate solution. Or giving up proposition 3, or 4, or 5, or 6. A theist, let me say that slowly, a theist who has a problem of evil because the theist wants to continue believing in God has to solve it by denying one of the other 5 propositions, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. All right, I hope that's clear in your mind now. I'm taking it directly from my lecture notes. Let's finish what I wrote on page 2 of my lecture notes. According to Mackie, most theists, and by theists, remember, I mean believers in the existence of God, believers in God. Most theists are unwilling to say any of these things. Most theists are unwilling to give up 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And they're certainly not going to give up 1. So most theists are unwilling to say any of those 5 things. Instead, according to Mackie, they explicitly maintain all the constituent propositions, but implicitly reject at least one of them in the course of the argument that explains away the problem of evil. Wow. Mackie is saying that theists are either wittingly or unwittingly engaged in fallacious thinking. He calls these fallacious solutions. He's saying the following. Theists say explicitly that they accept all 6 propositions. But when they get into a discussion about them, they end up implicitly rejecting one of them. And the reason they do that is so that they can believe the rest of them. So you could say that the theist isn't being forthright, or maybe even honest. The theist is saying one thing explicitly, but then turning around and giving up part of what has been asserted. And Mackie says that attempted explanation is a fallacious solution. You're trying to have it both ways. You want to believe all 6 propositions, but when push comes to shove, you're giving up one of the 6. You're weakening one of the 6 or abandoning it altogether. Now, Mackie is going to devote the bulk of this article to exposing some of these so-called fallacious solutions of the problem of evil. He's going to try to show that theists, while they claim to accept all 6 propositions, end up giving back what they have asserted, end up implicitly rejecting something that they have asserted. In addition to these fallacious solutions, Mackie describes what he calls half-hearted solutions of the problem of evil. And he doesn't say much more about these in the rest of his article, but he does say that there are adequate solutions to the problem of evil, such as his own, or actually I said atheists like Mackie don't solve the problem unless we redefine what it means to solve a problem. There are theists who adequately solve the problem of evil by giving up 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. That's what the indented paragraph was all about. So there are adequate solutions, there are fallacious solutions, and there are half-hearted solutions. So turn to page 3 of my notes, and I think we'll end with this today, and that means when we meet on Tuesday next week by video, we will pick up with the first so-called fallacious solution, and we'll go through them one by one until we finish all of them. Okay, look at the diagram or chart that I prepared for you on page 3. First of all, get a feel for the structure of it. It's a 2 by 2 box diagram. So on the left side in boldface, you can see I make a distinction between someone who explicitly rejects one of the 6 propositions on the first page of my lecture notes, and someone who explicitly asserts all 6 of them. So think of that as the explicit side of the diagram. You either explicitly reject one of the propositions or you explicitly assert all 6 of them. Now, across the top of the chart, you'll see that we'll call that the implicit side. Here, you either implicitly reject one of the 6 propositions or you implicitly assert all 6 of them. And this diagram, because it has 2 on the left side and 2 on the top, what happens when you cross them over? You get 2 times 2, or 4 cells, so 4 spaces. We can call them the northwest quadrant. I think of it in geographical terms. The state of Washington is in the far northwest of the country. The northeast is over where Boston and New England are. The southwest is down here, right, where Arizona and New Mexico are. And the southeast is where Georgia and Florida are. So this 2 by 2 diagram has 4 cells or quadrants. We can call them northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast. And that way there won't be any confusion about which one I'm referring to. I'll call them by those names. Let's begin our discussion with the northwest quadrant. Northwest. Here's what it says inside that quadrant. This is what I typed in there. These adequate solutions explicitly reject one of the 6 propositions without implicitly asserting it. And that's where the theist is who rejects 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Suppose a theist said, I would like to believe all 6 propositions, but I recognize that I can't because they can't all be true. And if I asserted all of them, I would be asserting at least one thing that's false, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to give up at least one of the propositions. I'm not going to give up proposition 1 because that's too important to me. As a theist, I want to continue believing in God. But I recognize that I have to give something up. So it's going to have to be either number 2, and I have to go back and look and see which one that is. I'm going to give up my belief that God is omnipotent. In other words, I'm going to start believing that there are limits to what God can do. Or I'll keep believing that and give up number 3. I'll stop believing that God is wholly good. I'll say God is mostly good. God is almost wholly good, but not quite. Or if I want to continue believing that, I could perhaps give up my belief that evil exists. And if you think that's odd or hilarious, I should tell you that there are people who believe in God who believe that evil does not exist. They claim that evil is an illusion. There appears to be evil in the world, but there really isn't any. And then they proceed to try to explain why there appears to be when there really isn't. So I don't want to go any further with that, but I want you to know that that would be an adequate solution of the problem of evil. Someone could continue believing 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, but start disbelieving in 4. That would be an adequate solution of the problem of evil. Okay? Another adequate solution would be to give up 5. Another adequate solution would be to give up 6. So there are several adequate solutions of the problem of evil. You explicitly reject at least one of the 6 propositions without turning around and implicitly accepting it later on. So you're consistent, right? You explicitly and implicitly reject at least one of the 6 propositions. Now there's a footnote there, and in that footnote, I go back to the point I've been making. I said, strictly speaking, atheists don't solve the problem of evil, they avoid it. And I hope you can see the difference between the two. It's the difference between having a problem and figuring out a way to deal with it. I'm calling that solving the problem, and not having the problem at all. Here's an example. People who have children and who are working sometimes have a problem finding care for their children so that they can work, so that they can go to work. That's a practical problem many people face. Okay? There are different solutions of that problem. One is to hire a babysitter to watch your children while you work. Another is to pay for daycare. Drop your children off at a daycare center and then go to work from there. You may also have kind of an informal babysitter, have a relative or a friend agree to watch your child for a day or for a week or for however long you can agree to. So there are various ways to solve the problem that I described, which is needing to work, but also needing to have someone care for your children. People who don't have children don't have that problem. It's just not a problem for them. If you have no children, then that is a problem you do not face. You don't solve the problem, you avoid that problem. Now, I'm at the point where you're going to start getting annoyed with me because probably you long ago grasped the distinction between solving a problem and avoiding a problem. So I'm going to stop with it. I hope by now the distinction has gotten through to you. Now let's read footnote 4, because I'm going to come back to that point I've been making about atheists. Should we say that atheists have a problem of evil and solve it, or that they don't have it at all and therefore avoid it? Here's what I say in footnote 4. In note 3, which we read a moment ago, I said that atheists avoid rather than solve the problem of evil. Now, suppose we want to say that by rejecting the first proposition that God exists, atheists solve the problem of evil. I mean, we might choose to talk like that. We might say that when an atheist like Mackie rejects the first proposition that God exists, he's solved the problem. If we want to talk that way, then we need to say that Mackie's solution is adequate. If we want to say that Mackie has a problem of evil, then a logical problem of evil, then we can say that by rejecting the first proposition, he has solved the problem. That would then be an adequate solution. It would be like a theist rejecting 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And here's the final sentence. We would then say either that atheists such as Mackie either, 1, avoid the problem of evil altogether. That was my original way of putting it. Or if we want to speak in a different way and say that atheists like Mackie have a problem, then we will say that they've solved it. They've given an adequate solution. So, to summarize all of this, all I'm saying is to atheists like Mackie, either they avoid the problem of evil by rejecting the first proposition, or if we want to insist that they face the problem of evil just like the theist does, then we would say they solve the problem and that is an adequate solution. So that's the northwest quadrant of the chart. Let's turn to the northeast quadrant. Let's just slide over to the right. Now, this is where half-hearted solutions go. And here's what Mackie says about them. He says, half-hearted solutions, quote, explicitly reject but implicitly assert one of the 6 constituent propositions. Now there's a footnote, and I'm going to read it in a moment, but let me give you my gloss on this. Half-hearted solutions are where a theist says explicitly, I reject proposition 3. But in the course of going forward from there, the theist ends up reasserting it implicitly. So notice what you're doing. You're explicitly rejecting that proposition. I'll say it's 3. But later, when you're arguing and discussing it, you reassert it implicitly. Things you say imply that it's true. That's what I mean by implicitly reasserting it. Right? You're taking it for granted. So why would Mackie call this half-hearted? What does it mean to be half-hearted? Half-hearted means you're not really making a full effort. Like suppose I'm playing volleyball and my team is losing pretty badly. It may be a hot day, I may be thirsty and tired. I may make a half-hearted effort to hit the ball back. Maybe I should dive and make a full effort to hit the ball back over the net or up into the air so that my teammate can hit it over the net. But instead, I make a half-hearted effort. I just kind of toss my body to the sand without really making a full effort. So that's what half-hearted means. Mackie calls this a half-hearted solution, I think, because the theist explicitly rejects a proposition but doesn't follow through with it fully, right? You boldly say, I reject proposition 3, but later while discussing it, you stop rejecting it. In fact, things you say suggest that you are now implicitly accepting it. So the whole thing is half-hearted. You weren't really fully into it when you rejected 3. Right? It was a half-hearted rejection of 3. If you made a full-hearted rejection of 3, then you would stick with it later on while you're discussing it. Now, Mackie would say that he is making a full-hearted rejection of 1. Mackie is saying, I, as an atheist, reject proposition 1, that there's a God. I reject it explicitly, and I'm going to stick to it in my discussion consistently. I'm not going to half-heartedly come back and reassert it or say something that implies that I believe it. So a full-hearted solution to the problem of evil would be Mackie's, for example, where you reject number 1 and stick with it. And there are full-hearted theistic solutions as well. Let's go back to the northwest quadrant. If a theist explicitly rejects, let's say, proposition 3, and at no point later on implicitly accepts it, then the theist has not made a half-hearted rejection. It's a full-hearted rejection. So it occurs to me that I could write I could write some additional words in the northwest quadrant. In fact, bear with me as I make a note on my notes, because I'll forget it if I don't. I want to make a change. Here's what I've written. These adequate solutions, and now I'm going to add parenthesis, i.e. full-hearted solutions. Right? Adequate solutions are full-hearted as opposed to half-hearted. So let me finish writing that. Are you with me? I found the term half-hearted naturally contrasts with full-hearted. And it made me wonder, what would a full-hearted solution be? And I'm pretty sure, maybe I'll give it some more thought, I'm pretty sure that that's what Mackie is calling an adequate solution. It's full-hearted. That means what you do explicitly is also what you do implicitly. Whereas the half-hearted solutions involve explicitly rejecting one of the 6 propositions and then later walking it back and implicitly accepting what you so boldly asserted. What you so boldly rejected. Okay, so don't be half-hearted when it comes to solving the problem of evil. Let's look at footnote 5, because in this footnote, I'm going to quote Mackie, who gives some examples of what he calls half-hearted solutions. There are 3 of them that he gives. Here they are. Footnote 5, examples. Number 1, a theist may restrict God's power, which means rejecting the proposition that God is omnipotent, while, quote, keeping the term omnipotence and, quote, thinking in other contexts that his, namely God's power, is really unlimited. So the first half-hearted solution that Mackie gives as an example is a theist who says explicitly, I give up the proposition that God is omnipotent. That's proposition 2. But guess what? The theist keeps using the term omnipotent, even though the theist has given up the belief that God is omnipotent. The theist keeps using the term omnipotent and later starts thinking or even saying that God's power is really unlimited. So what you gave up explicitly, you came back to believe again. Right? You resumed believing that God is omnipotent, even though you had originally explicitly disavowed it or rejected it. Second example, someone might say that evil is an illusion and not real, and that would mean rejecting the proposition that evil exists, while, quote, thinking inconsistently that this illusion is itself an evil. Now, think about what Mackie is saying. Imagine a theist saying, I reject proposition 4, which says evil exists. Evil is an illusion. Now, a discussion ensues. That person, in the course of the discussion, says that evil is an illusion, and if I ask, is an illusion a good thing or a bad thing? The theist would probably say it's a bad thing. And then I would ask, why would God allow a bad thing? Why would God allow there to be illusions? Aren't illusions themselves evils? Things that it would be better didn't exist? And the theist might say, yes, they are. Illusions are evil. But wait a minute. You said when you rejected proposition 4 that you explicitly reject the proposition that evil exists. And now, in the course of your discussion with me, you've admitted that illusions are themselves evils. Well, wait a minute. I thought you said evil doesn't exist. You see, the theist is trying to have it both ways. Explicitly reject the existence of evil, but end up implicitly asserting that there is evil later on. That's a half-hearted solution. And finally, the third example in footnote 5, imagine someone saying that evil is merely privation of good. Now, privation is an old-fashioned word. It think of it as absence of. So this really says evil is the absence of good. It's not a positive quality of a thing. It just means that goodness is lacking in it. Evil is not the presence of something. It's the absence of something, namely good. So imagine a theist saying that. Evil is the absence of good. That would be to deny the proposition that evil exists. When you say evil is the absence of something, you're denying that it's the presence of something. You're denying that evil exists. And then later, suppose you began to think that the absence of good is an evil, that the absence of good is an evil. Now you're saying something that contradicts what you said explicitly. So Mackie has now described what he calls half-hearted solutions. 3 of them he gave as examples, and I put them all in footnote 5 for you. That's about all he says about half-hearted solutions. Now let me wind things down for the day. Let's turn to the southwest quadrant of my chart or diagram. This is where fallacious solutions go. All I want to do is define them, and then we'll pick up with that Tuesday. Fallacious solutions, according to Mackie, and I'm quoting him, explicitly maintain all the 6 constituent propositions, but end up implicitly rejecting at least one of them in the course of the argument that explains away the problem of evil. Notice that's the flip side of a half-hearted solution. Go back. Half-hearted solutions explicitly reject at least one of the 6 propositions, but end up implicitly reasserting it. Fallacious solutions are very different. Here, you're explicitly accepting all 6, but implicitly rejecting one of them later on when you're arguing and discussing the issue. And Mackie says this is a kind of, well, he doesn't say this, but it's a kind of dishonesty, or, I hate to say this, a kind of stupidity. Why would you explicitly assert all 6 and then later backtrack on one of them and implicitly reject one of them? There are really 2 explanations. You're doing it on purpose to mislead people or deceive people, which is bad, morally bad, or you are unaware that you're doing it, that you don't even realize that you accepted all 6 propositions, and now later you're walking back one of them and implicitly rejecting it. Maybe it's because you're stupid, pardon the expression. Maybe because you're not a careful thinker. Right? Your mind isn't working well. Right? You're kind of in a stupor. Right? You are not thinking things through. Maybe you don't even realize that you're doing this. So your fallacious solution could be witting or unwitting. Witting means you know you're doing it, and therefore the question is, why would you do it knowingly? It seems a kind of deception or dishonesty. But maybe you're doing it unwittingly. You're not even aware that you're doing it. And if that's the case, the atheist like Mackie can point it out to you. And that's exactly what Mackie is going to do in the remainder of this essay. He's going to take up one fallacious solution after another and reply to it and show why it's fallacious. Okay, that's enough. We're an hour and 19 minutes in, and we'll pick up right here next time on Tuesday. Remember, both lectures next week will be online. Both of them will be posted on Canvas, just like today's. But the Tuesday after that, the 21st, we're going to be back in the classroom, unless things change. So unless you hear otherwise from me, plan on being in the classroom on Tuesday the 21st. Okay? See you then. Have a great day.